All right, let's talk about the tools that you need to actually execute on your work and get stuff done. The first thing I want to talk about is a template that's called Estimate versus Actuals. And this has basically two purposes. So the first one is before you make a proposal to a client, you'll need to estimate the cost on your end. And we talked about this a little bit when we talked about pricing. You need to know your costs, right? You are at the end of the day selling both your time and perhaps other people's time if you're going to hire somebody or if you're going to buy some asset such as stock photography, phones, or something like this. So you have your own costs that you need to calculate. Doesn't mean that that's going to be the price of the project, but you need to know your bottom bar. Now, so we want to calculate that. So going back here into the template business processes docs, I do have here one that's called Estimate versus Actuals. And here's how this thing works and how you can use this. Basically, it's a table, and these tables list your tasks or expenses. So let's imagine in this imaginary project that you're going to do some strategy, and you're going to do some art direction, and you write here the steps of the project. Now here, I'm going to do this, and let's say I've calculated my hourly rate when we talked about pricing, and I know that I need to make $250 an hour to make sure that that's my break-even rate. So if I do these tasks and I estimate that the strategy is going to take me 3 hours, art direction 5 hours, and design 3 hours, again, these are just random numbers, and also I'll need to buy a photo, right? So this is not really hours, it's quantity of one, and the image is going to cost me $50. That sums up my expenses, at least my estimate of expenses, at $2,800. Okay, so that's kind of helps me out as a starting point. Now, what I did here is I've added 20% buffer to this price because we're always wrong with our estimates. So after I've kind of filled in these assumptions that I have about the project, I'll get this big number, which is basically my bottom bar for the project, okay? Now, so this is step one. When you're pricing a project, you're going to use this estimate tool to understand what your bottom bar is. Now, here's when it gets interesting. Let's say I've negotiated and I've actually ended up charging $4,500 as my final price, okay? Now, when the project is over and I tracked my time, which is something that we'll talk about in the upcoming video, I'm going to come here and I'm going to fill in the actual hours that I ended up working because I want to know what was the real cost and how different was it, right? Was my estimate even good? So let's say that instead of 3 hours, the strategy actually took me 5 hours, but art direction, instead of taking me 5 hours, let's say it also actually took 5 hours, and then design actually took me 2 hours, and I had to end up and buy 2 photos, so that cost me $100. So while I thought this is going to cost me $2,800, it ended up actually costing me $3,100. Now, it's a good thing that we added the buffer, but here's the interesting thing. Now I can run the calculation of understanding how many hours I ended up working and calculate that based on the final price and understand that the actual hourly rate that I made on this project ended up being $321, so more than I actually wanted, which means that I have some profit here beyond the cost, right? This is the cost. I pay myself a fixed salary, okay? So this is what I need to pay myself a salary, but I've made some profit beyond that. So that's really very quickly helps you to understand this, estimate before the project and understand how you performed and estimated after the project. Now, the way that I would use this is I would go ahead and duplicate this every time because if you want to save the stats of previous projects, you don't want to replace the data every time. You want to have this as a memory so that in 3 months, when you'll have to, estimate a new web design project, you can say, hey, let's go back to the project I did a few months ago and see what I estimated there and what actually happened. And this will kind of inform you to make better estimates. So when you duplicate, you'll see that you can duplicate the data so that these tables are not connected. So just make sure you click duplicate the data. I'm going to undo what I did right now. I'm going to delete this, but just make sure that you duplicate the data. All right, so this is how you're going to use estimates versus actuals. The next thing I want to talk about is proposals. So let's get started, and I want to show you a real proposal of mine. This is a proposal for a client of mine that's called Lucia. We actually talked about them. I showed you their product earlier. So this is the proposal for their marketing website and design system. I want to show you how this is built, and then, you know what, actually, let's get started by giving you an overview of how my proposals look like. So we can go here into the proposal template, and this is basically the structure for all of my proposals, and you can copy and paste it from here. I start with an overview where I summarize what we talked about in the meeting and what are basically the goals that they're trying to achieve with this project. Usually I would, if this is a new client, I would add something like why work with us, and I'll customize this based on my values or experience relevant to the client. In this Lucia case, because I knew the client before, I didn't have the need to add this, but sometimes it's very useful. Then I would describe the process and the cost. So this is phase one. This is what you're going to get as deliverables in phase one. Here's the deadline for phase one, and here's what this costs. And then I would detail the terms, and usually I would have these very basic terms on every proposal, and these are 50% down payment before the work, and then usually, depending on the project of course, but it usually would be something like 25% after I present the design and 25% after the final deliveries have been sent. So either we finalize the design or maybe we develop the website or something like this. Sometimes, depending on the project, this might be breaked differently if the project is more complicated, but this is kind of like the basic one. I also always mention that the prices do not include font licensing or images as required. Now this is basic. Even though I write this here, usually, as you can see it here, I usually do take them into account, because usually I provide, I create the assets. Creating the assets specifically on websites is usually part of the proposal. However, sometimes I do like to mention this, because sometimes they would pick something that is very expensive and that was not included in the website, right? If they want to have a very special font and use it on an app or a website with a lot of traffic, these things can be very, very expensive. And font licensing usually is actually a recurring price if you're using it for font embedment, and so I don't want to take ownership on these things, so I mention it right here. Usually I include 3 rounds of iteration, and after that an hourly rate. So this is of course in new Israeli shekels, so you'll probably want to customize this, but the purpose of this is to give a high hourly rate so that they'll be motivated not to get to this point, not to get to beyond 3 rounds of iterations or revisions, right? So they'll want to push everything that they need within these revisions and then try to avoid this. So it's high on purpose. For me specifically, I mentioned that the price do not include VAT depending on where you are or where they're paying from. So of course, you may not need this term. I always say that the payment is due 10 days after the invoice is sent. So it's not like something like net 30 when they can pay me in 2 months or something. And the last thing is that the intellectual ownership of the design will be transferred only after the final payment. So basically what that means is that if the project for some reason did not end and they did not pay the final payment, one, they can't really use it, or second of all, I can do whatever I want because I own the intellectual ownership of the project. So that's the basic template for the proposal. Let's see how it looks in real life. So Lucia, marketing website and design system. Lucia is looking to upgrade its marketing website and total brand visibility to look bigger and better, create more trust and confidence with its customer, and increase sign-up. You see here that we're talking about the goals, right? Not just needs a new website, right? It talks about trust, talks about conversion, sign-ups. While adding a new product offering, messages needs to be clear and straightforward and keep high conversion rate. So the phases are, first of all, we're going to work on the marketing website and brand. We'll start by strategizing content architecture for all marketing website. In parallel, we'll explore a different visual language and choose a direction. After approving wireframes and visual direction, we'll design a new site. So the deliverables will be new responsive web design, updated brand assets, design system for further use, and work in collaboration with developers, with their developers, because they wanted to develop their own website. It's going to take about 11 weeks, and it's going to be 80,000 new Israeli shekels, which is about 20 something US dollars, 20 something thousand US dollars. Phase 2 is a product update. This is something shorter, but you can see it basically follows the same structure. And in the last one, it's kind of marketing assets. So here, it was basically just giving them templates of optional things, right? If you want an email template, it's 1,000 new Israeli shekels per one. If you want 1, 2, 3, just let me know how much you want them. So this is just a little bit of a different, just because these are kind of like optional things, right? And I also try to optionally sell them on development, but they didn't buy it. And you can see that the terms here are pretty much the same that what I just showed you. So I create this template within InDesign just to, lay it out nicer, but it doesn't really matter. This can be a Google Doc with your logo or whatever you want. You don't need a fancy system for this. I mean, I've built Prospero, which is a proposal system, so I know that it can be helpful, but I'm just telling you, you don't have to do anything crazy. You can use any layout tool, and I'll give you the template for this proposal in InDesign below this video. Now, the next thing that you want to do is you want to use something like HelloSign, where you can drop in that PDF. You can drop in places for signature, and they can sign that proposal online. And this is a tool that I use for free, actually. This is really great, and it's free. So again, this is what I use for online signatures. All right, so this is proposals. The next thing is invoicing. Now, it's hard for me to give advice about invoicing just because this really changes, depends on where you live. And what I will say is that it's probably a good idea to use some kind of an invoicing software versus in some places it's legal and possible to create your own invoicing in Google Doc or something like that, and it's valid. I'm based in Israel, so here this is just completely illegal, and you have to work with kind of a recognized invoicing system. But depends on where you are. It might be a possibility. However, I do think that it's really great to work within software like this that will enable you to see kind of trends and visualize the data pretty easily. Right? We're going to track the P&L and the financials, but it's really good if your invoicing system also kind of show you kind of trends and the graphs and see what was paid and what not. So I recommend, I think I worked with a US software that was FreshBooks, so I think it's good. I don't want to, I have no affiliation with any of these, and I'm using something local here in Israel, so I don't want to make recommendations. But I think it looks good, so I recommend you find something to work with. Now, the last thing I want to talk about in terms of execution is how to manage projects. So my tool of choice in this case is usually Trello, and this is Trello. Trello is also a free tool that is highly customizable, and it's very easy for clients to understand what's going on. The way that it works is that you can create these kind of columns, and then you have what's called cards that you can write your tasks or where you are right now. And each one of these cards can have a checklist, and you can have here discussion in the comments. So they can see basically visually what you're working on. You can tell them, hey, I've finished this task, please review it. And once they approve it, they move it here to done. So this is kind of a collaborative way to see what are you working on right now. You can also prioritize and say, hey, if this is really important, bring this to the top. Now, the reason that I use this, first of all, they are always knowing what I'm working on, and it's really easy to collaborate here in the comments instead of losing tracks. Now, when this gets really useful is after you send a design and they start sending in the revisions. If you do this on email, you're going to have thousands of emails, threads, and things are going to get lost. And if you keep track of it on a Trello board like this, it's going to be much, much cleaner and a better experience for all of them. So again, this is a free tool, and you can invite them here. You can see that I've invited my clients to collaborate on this board with me. So it's really, really helpful and a great tool to use.